think it's probably fair to say that the SNP as a political vehicle is probably at its weakest and most vulnerable for several decades. Do you accept that?
Look, I think every party goes through its challenges and fluctuations. I mean, people said the same thing to us when we had our trickier election in 2017, and people told us that was the end of the party, and that was us. We were done, and it was on a terminal decline. Only for us, of course, to win well in 2019 and win again in 2021. So, no, look, many people will write us off and have done over the years. This party is not one to be written off. And this party, I have to say, is one that I'm confident will continue to win elections.
And obviously, independence remains on the docket for you guys. It would be shocking to learn in this interview if it wasn't.
An exclusive.
It would be an exclusive. Going back briefly to the kind of the issues with public services, you accept that there are parts of Scotland's public services that could be better, and you've been your argument would be is that you're hamstrung by a UK government that's making political decisions you wouldn't necessarily follow. A lot of your opponents would say that part of the problem is that you don't want things in Scotland to be positive, so that independence looks like a better outcome.
No, look, I think actually people will be more likely to vote for independence if they can see what we're doing with our devolved powers and that we can make things even better with the full powers of independence. That's been our argument.
That's the Alex Salmond school of thought.
Whatever you want, you can term it in whichever way you want. But it's my genuine belief that if we're delivering for people with the powers that we have and showing how Scotland can be progressive, how we can have that social contract with the people that goes hand in hand with economic dynamism, and that's the vision. If we can do that and demonstrate that practically, making a difference to people's everyday lives, they can say, well, they can do that in education, in health, transport, police, justice. Well, if they can do it with that, well, look what they can do with the full powers of independence, and I think that's our strong argument. And I think the arguments of 2014 from the opposition are falling apart. You know, they talked about the strong, broad shoulders of the UK. I don't think there's anybody that can describe the UK as having broad, strong shoulders in terms of its economy. It is a poor society with pockets of rich people, as the Financial Times described it. And I just think the more and more we can demonstrate what we can do with the powers of devolution, and then say, well, imagine what we could do, what more we could do with the powers of independence, is quite a compelling argument.
I mean, I think I was reading something from Mark Blythe, who's an economist who you guys have used to promote independence, or at least have expert advice on. He basically said, you know, you got the SNP criticised Brexit. He would argue correctly as being a self-inflicted wound. But independence would be 10 times worse, surely, certainly in the short term. I mean, it would be Brexit on a different scale.
No, I don't agree. I mean, one, you would get access to a market that's 7 times the size of the UK's.
After about 8 years.
Once you join, well, we don't know how long, of course, joining the European Union would take. But ultimately, we also managed to have the vast, fiscal powers in our hands and the vast majority of monetary levers as well. Now, ultimately, there will be a transition phase. I'm not going to argue with you otherwise. And we'd approach that transitional phase in a pragmatic manner. But for me, when I look at independent countries of Scotland's size that are in Europe, that don't have half the resource that we do, but yet they have a higher national income per head, higher GDP per head, lower income and lower inequality, then for me, I think about all that we have here in Scotland and think, well, why on earth can we not also thrive, let alone, not just thrive, but do incredibly well globally and compete globally? Or the alternative is we're anchored to this Brexit Britain that there's almost no doubt and no argument from any serious economist that is taking us on the wrong trajectory.
But surely leaving one political union, as you argued very strongly against ahead of Brexit, to be a lone soldier, it's exactly the same process you're promoting with independence. It's just you're hoping for EU membership that could be easy to be vetoed by somewhere like Spain, and just begging for membership in order to do well.
No, look, first of all, being part of the European Union is about, of course, there is an economic advantage in doing so. As I say, a market that's 7 times the size of the UK's, but it's also about the kind of country you want to be as an independent nation. We want to be an outward-looking country that is part of that also looks towards doing as much global cooperation as possible, including, by the way, with the rest of the UK. Our strongest relationship will be with the rest of the UK on matters of global significance and importance, including potentially defence cooperation, for example. So for me, that is what independence is about, but ultimately you choosing to do that At the moment, we don't have that choice. At the moment, so much of what is done to us is done by an unelected government, certainly not a government that Scotland voted for, and against our will. And Brexit is just one example of that. It's tip of the iceberg in terms of examples where things have been done to us that we either actively voted against or that are against our values. Cost of living crisis is another one. We had nothing to do with that cost of living crisis, and yet is literally harming people up and down Scotland.
But you failed to grow the economy in the 17 years that the SNP have been.
Well, first of all, that's not true. GDP, of course, has increased since 2007 at a greater rate than UK GDP. The productivity has also increased at a greater rate than UK productivity, so it's just factually...
Not enough to bridge the gap between what you blame the UK government for.
Well, factually incorrect. So the second point I would make, which is really important, is that when it comes to the vast majority of fiscal and monetary levers, they're not in my hands. By God, I wish they were in my hands. They're not. They're in the hands of the UK government. And the UK government over the last 14 years was a significant proportion of the 17 years that we've been in government. For those 14 years, have chosen to make decisions that I think have damaged our economy. So there's only so much we can do. And as I say, we've shown when it comes to GDP per head, when it comes to productivity, that we are able to advance where the UK is. But we're always going to be held back by the UK government that has its hands on the tiller and steering us in the wrong direction.
We'll move on to more current things. The Hate Crime Act, something you brought through Parliament yourself as Justice Secretary, comes into force on April the 1st. Women will be among those who aren't protected under it. Oh, that can't be right, surely.
So look, as opposed to you and I, as two men, debating what's best for women, I tend to think it's better to listen to the voices of women. And it was, of course, the likes of Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland, Zero Tolerance, who, of course, organisations that represent women, who said that they thought that when it came to misogyny, which is so pervasive in our society, that a standalone bill would be better. That doesn't just cover stirring up offences against women and girls, but covers a much wider, broader broader category of misogyny than what would be covered under the hate crime framework. I think they were right, and ultimately, of course, we asked Baroness Helena Kennedy to do the work for us, and I'm very pleased that we're progressing with a bill to tackle misogyny.
It's been very slow, though. It's been very slow going.
Look, I would argue with that, because it was important that we did the review and that we asked Baroness Kennedy to lead on a lot of that work. So I don't think it's been slow.
Do you not think it should have been faster?
Well, look, you'll always look at legislative timetables. There's always pressures, and some of that is unexpected. For example, we're now going to look to bring forward Scottish-specific legislation around Horizon as one example. So you can have things that legislatively perhaps you didn't expect or didn't anticipate, which will slow down the legislative process. But ultimately, Scotland, I think, through passing this legislation on misogyny, could lead the way not just for the rest of the UK, but for many parts of Europe too.
When do you anticipate them to be brought in and be, in force?
In terms of the misogyny legislation, well, obviously, I won't dictate to the Parliament what the timetable should be, but I'm very keen that we make as much progress as quickly as we possibly can. I think, particularly post Baroness Kennedy's review, we began to pick up the pace in terms of misogyny work. So I would want it in as quickly as possible. If there's any way of, frankly, expediting that process, we'd be happy to discuss that with Parliament.
Do you think it could be passed in law by the end of the Parliament?
Yeah, yes. I would certainly anticipate that's the case.
Next year?
Again, I'll not go any further than what I've said already, but yes, absolutely want it to be the case that it's passed by the end of the parliamentary term.
I mean, you've spoken about it before. You've been on the face or on a victim of racist hatred on more occasions than obviously more than one occasion is bad, more than zero occasions is bad even. So I imagine the Hate Crime Act is quite a personal piece of legislation for you. Some people would argue that it's justified. Others, in the last few days, and when it was making its way through Parliament, has suggested that it could have a chilling effect on free speech and lead to vexatious complaints. Do you understand why people are concerned about the Act?
Look, I don't dismiss people's concerns around freedom of expression. I think they're important in any society, that we have the freedom to insult, the freedom to offend, the freedom to criticise, particularly when it comes to governments. We should be on the receiving end Whether it's people have every right to give us criticism and insult and satire. So these things absolutely should be protected. That's why, of course, the hate crime bill has freedom of expression protections built within it. I mean, literally on the face of the bill, explicitly, is protections around freedom of expression, let alone the reasonable person defence, let alone the fact, of course, all of our legislation has to comply with the European Convention on Human Rights. In terms of it being personal, and you've made the point that obviously I've been a victim of racial and religious hatred over the years. I think for me, I look at the protections I have as a person of colour, and there has been a stirring up offence in relation to racial hatred for most of my life. I was born in 1985, and that offence has existed since 1986, with almost zero controversy. And the threshold is actually lower than the threshold that we're proposing. That's in the Hate Crime Act. So for me, I think as a person of colour, well, if I've got that protection in terms of my race, then why should somebody not have it because of their religion, their disability, their sexuality, and so on and so forth? In terms of, as I say, freedom of expression, I worked hard with a number of groups, including, of course, with opposition MPs. And I would give an example of, Professor Adam Tompkins, no longer MSP, was an MSP, of course, previously Professor of Public Law at Glasgow University. Worked closely with Adam to make sure that we had those freedom of expression safeguards within the bill. So I don't agree with anybody that there'll be a chilling effect. I don't think there will be. I think this bill will come into force. It will do the job it's meant to do. And frankly, much like other pieces of legislation where there's a lot of political and opposition interest, people will move on. And I have to say, having knocked the doors in Greenock over the weekend, a grand total of 0 people raised the Hate Crime Act with me, and very few people do on the doorstep.
I mean, you mentioned Adam Tompkins. He also warned that police would end up, quote, dealing with and dismissing ill-founded complaints made by people who are offended, upset, hurt or distressed by something someone else has said. That sounds like a waste of police time.
Police are really, I think, well trained, adept at dealing with any complaints that might be vexatious or, frankly, are not going to meet the criminal threshold. And that's not unique to a hate crime act or hate crime more generally.
But a lot of those things are going to go down on a record as being hate crime incidents, even if they're not a crime. I mean, that's surely not fair. That's going to have an effect on what people do. They're going to self-police.
Just remember what the police have said today, that the hate crime incident isn't attached to an individual. The reason they record a hate crime incident, so if they believe there has been a hate crime incident that doesn't meet the threshold for criminality, it is important to be able to spot patterns of hate crime that might be taking place. So, for example, if there's a spike in anti-Semitism, spike in homophobia, really important for police to be able to see that level of, or any spike in hatred that might be happening, but may not quite reach a level of a criminal threshold.
But I mean, Callum Steele, who you'll know, the former chair of the Police Federation, who look after the rank and file, said, "I suspect that within a very short period of time we'll have data, in inverted commas, suggesting Scotland to be one of the most hateful countries on earth." I mean, surely that must worry you as a possibility, given that I don't think that's how you would describe Scotland.
It's definitely not how I would describe Scotland, but I also don't think Scotland is immune from hate, and therefore we've got to have legislation in place to protect people. And often we're talking about the most vulnerable and marginalised groups from hatred, and I'm not probably the only one in the world that worries about some of the discourse around marginalised communities. And it feels that as a society we're becoming more and more polarised globally. And we'll see how that plays out in many elections right across the world. And so it's really important to have a strong framework of legislation against hatred. So as I say, I've got every confidence in police's ability to make sure that they're dealing with complaints in the appropriate fashion. So those that meet the criminal threshold, investigating them, those that don't, dealing with them, and those that are just vexatious, then of course, as police do, I suspect on a daily basis, dealing with those vexatious complaints in an appropriate manner.
I mean, this could end up going the same way as the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act. That's how a lot of people speak about it.
Absolutely won't. I mean, this is a robust piece of legislation.
You think it's better than that piece of legislation?
Much better than that piece of legislation. It is a robust piece of legislation. It has been scrutinised extensively. It has compromised from its original form to the final form in terms of the Act. It was, supported by every party bar the Conservatives, but the only ones who didn't. And maybe that's unsurprising, given, quite frankly, the Conservative Party of late have taken money from a racist, misogynist and as a party at a UK level, most certainly, that's been I'm afraid a number of senior MPs have been involved in Islamophobic slurs and insinuations. So, the Conservative Party, as I said to Douglas Ross last week, should probably look to get their own party in order before they oppose a hate crime act.
Let's move on to talk about one of your close friends and allies in Michael Matheson. Not to go over the details too much, £11,000 roaming charge bill. He misled Holyrood chiefs, which we know. He misled yourself as in your role as First Minister. He lied to the press. He lied to the public. As good as a minister and as close a friend and ally he was to yourself, you should have sacked him in November.
I always believe in due process. I said that. And Michael is a decent man who made a mistake. He's served this Parliament, this country well over the years, and he did make a mistake. There's no.
It sounds like he made several.
Well, he made a mistake fundamentally when he found out about his boys using the iPad. He immediately, first of all, paid back the money, but he should have at that point, of course, been upfront with everyone, myself included, about what had happened. And that's a mistake he's made. SPCB have obviously published their the final recommendations of their report. They've obviously not published the full report yet. It's right that the Standards Committee now investigates the matter. And Michael has paid a price, not just, of course, rightly paying back the £11,000. That's the correct thing to have done. I agreed, of course, that he should step back from his government role and step down from his government role. And I think he's learned, I would hope he's learned his lesson in terms of the importance of being upfront about these matters.
Were you advised back in November by your special advisors, your political advisors, to sack him or to get him to resign then?
Look, I'm not going to talk about conversations I have with my political advisors. That's
yes or no. Were you advised to sack him? Did you decide to do something that your advisors didn't choose?
I make the judgment about who's in my government and who's not. Not any of my special advisors. My special advisors.
What was their advice?
But I'm not going to tell you the advice I get of my special advisors. That's between me and my special advisors. But no, there was no. Everybody that I spoke to understood exactly what I was saying, which is that what I said publicly at the time, that Michael Matheson should be subject to due process, and it was very, very clear come the turn of the year that due process was going to consume his time, and therefore it was the right thing for Michael to do, to step down from government.
The special advisor question is important because there are rumours that you don't listen to them, that your closest advisors provide you with advice, and instead you tend to follow the advice of your wife. To borrow Dominic Cummings' phrase, which he used to describe Boris Johnson, sounds like you could be a bit of a Scottish trolley.
So what's the evidence basis that I listen to my wife?
It's
on what issue?
Discussions, rumours in Holyrood.
But what's the issue? Can you give me an example of an issue that you think I would have listened to my wife on, that I wouldn't have made my own judgment or would have gone against my special advisors?
I think it might just be the person you take advice from most often.
No, well, look, so you're not able to provide evidence of that. So look, I try to keep my family very much out of my politics. Where I can. My special advisors are fantastic. I've chosen, they serve because I've appointed them, and they give excellent advice. And, I would say ultimately people expect their First Minister to lead. So I'll get advice from not just my special advisors. I said to you a moment ago that I take advice from my colleagues, whether it's in the Scottish Parliament, whether it's in local government, whether it's in Westminster. But ultimately I've got to make the judgment on various different issues. And that's true of Michael Matheson, that's true of people that serve in my cabinet. That's ultimately a decision that I make, who serves in my cabinet and who serves in my government. Look, I ultimately make the judgment, but I listen to a whole range of, not just advisors, but a whole range of colleagues. That's been part of my approach from the beginning, is to try to have as a big a tent as possible, to try to listen to as many of my colleagues as possible.
Do you think Michael Matheson should have taken the, I think it's 12 and a half, give or take, tax-free ministerial golden goodbye? It effectively means he hasn't paid a penny.
Again, that's a matter between Michael and the Parliament.
But on a principle basis.
To make a judgment of, and Michael has served not just this Parliament well, served this country well, and as I say, he's a decent person who made a really daft mistake, and he's paying a price for that mistake.
So as long as he's in the First Minister's view a decent person, he doesn't have to actually pay any financial price, because fundamentally the taxpayers have paid his bill.
No, look, ultimately that's a decision for Michael to consider and to ponder, and it's between him and the Parliament. It's not really between me and Michael. The severance payment doesn't come from me.
I mean, if this was a Tory minister,
Parliament.
if this was a Tory minister, you would be up in arms saying that this would represent Westminster's inherent flaws.
No, look, ultimately, again, that's a decision between Michael and the Parliament, whether he returns back the money or not. All I'm saying is that Michael made a mistake and is paying a price for that mistake. He's lost his job.
If you'd have made that mistake, would you have accepted that payout?
Say that again?
If you'd have made the same mistake,
well, I
would
wouldn't
you
have
have
made. I wouldn't have made that mistake. Is the point? I mean, again, I'm not going over all of the details of what happened in Michael's case, but he made a mistake, and he's paying a price for that mistake. I would hope that I wouldn't make such a mistake.
But if you did, you'd surely not accept that money.
Look again.
It's more than the bill.
You're talking about kind of hypotheticals that are never going to happen. I'm not going to make that mistake. And ultimately, when it comes to ministerial severance, that's a decision between the ex-minister in all cases and the Parliament.
We'll come back to the here and now because I know we're running out of time. 2024, we've talked about it. It's going to be a big general election year. Will you quit if you fall to second behind Labour?
Again, I don't hypothecate in losing elections. I only hypothecate in winning elections. And for me, that's what's ultimately important. I've got to go into that election confident that the SNP can win. And ultimately, I've got every confidence in my colleagues, my candidates, and my ability to win that election.
You must be looking over your shoulder a little bit, though, at potential challenges from within the party?
No, that's not the way it works. But what every good leader should do is try to cultivate talent of the next generation. And I've got
so why isn't
that.
Kate Forbes in your cabinet?
I've got that. Well, I asked her to be my cabinet, of course.
You didn't ask her when the job came up as health secretary.
Well, you would have to speak to Kate why she chose not to.
Did you ask her then?
Not to be
when Michael left government. Did you ask her
to
come back?
No, I didn't.
Did you consider it?
Kate, again, I'm not going to go into what I did or didn't consider, but of course I did ask Kate to come into government initially, and she chose for very valid reasons that were her own. And that were pertinent to her family, why she decided not to do so. So that's ultimately, of course, a decision for Kate. But bringing forward Neil Gray, of course, Mary McCallan, Jenny Goruth, the excellent work I do with Stephen regularly around Westminster. There's a lot of talent within our party, and any leader that's worth their salt will make sure that they are bringing forward and cultivating the next generation. Nicola did that clearly with me and with a number of others as well, and I've got to make sure I'm doing that, but I intend to be First Minister and leader of this party for quite a long time yet.
Insiders, party critics of yours, have suggested that if you lose 20 seats at the next election, they would seek to trigger a contest. How would you face up to that?
Well, look, again, I don't hypothecate in losing. I don't intend to lose 20 seats. And you've almost answered the question with your question. Party critics. There'll be some in a party of almost 70,000 members, as we are. There'll be some who didn't vote for you, and they'll criticise, usually through anonymous sources, and that's just what some people will do. But I have to say, the party that I'm leading, I'm really proud of the fact that, by and large, we've got strong discipline, we've got unity. And that is the oldest maxim in politics, that if you're a divided party, you don't win an election. So I would say to all of my party colleagues that it's really important that we unite behind the party and make sure that we're winning, because if we're winning, then we're advancing the cause of independence. And that ultimately, I know every single member of my party, regardless of who they voted for in a leadership contest or what their views are on any of our policies, they absolutely believe in advancing the cause of independence.
There's a number of people who we speak to in Holyrood who are talking about this suggests that you're actually in quite a perilous and weak position at the minute.
I don't agree at all. I'm leading a government, strong cabinet. We've got a strong track record of delivery. Yep, despite the challenges, we still, by most polls, remain ahead of our political opponents. So I think we go into this general election with our heads held up high, with a really strong message of why people should vote for the SNP. And as I say, I'm confident of winning that general election.
And last question for you, bit of a challenge. Give us one and only one reason within 10 seconds or less why Scottish Sun readers should vote SNP at the next general election.
If you want Scotland's voice to be heard by Westminster, if you don't want Scotland to be ignored, then you have to vote for the SNP. We're the only party that will bang the drum and that will advocate for Scotland's interest every single day of the year.
Not sure if that was under 10 seconds, but
Close.
First Minister HUMZA YOUSAF, thank you very much for speaking
Thank
to
you.
us.
Pleasure.